My involvement in the anti-war movement is an expression of my own faith and my own understanding of what it means to be a pastor. To be a pastor means you're interpreting the foundations of our faith, the foundations of Scripture and life together for a larger group of people and for the community. It's a public witness. The act of getting up in the pulpit every Sunday is a public act. We don't say who could be listening, who could be coming in. So every word you say is not to just an immediate group of people, but it's to the world, in effect. And now with the nature of new technology, with sermons and blogs and podcasts, it really has become a very public act. So as an expression of that public role of being a pastor, it's important to talk about topics that are touching all the lives around us, and the lives of maybe the people who aren't right in our mix, but who are still part of the family of God. So in light of that, number one, to not talk about the war or not talk about the goal of peace is to fail to address something that they're hearing about every day in the news. It's a failing to address something that is touching lives, hundreds of thousands of lives in our nation and around the world, and it's failing to talk with integrity about a foundation of our faith, which is peace. If we name Jesus the Prince of Peace, if we read the Beatitudes where blessed are the peacemakers, and yet do nothing more than just read those passages, then we're not doing it with integrity. So it's a combination of speaking to the congregation on a topic that's affecting them and that they're hearing about, talking about it out of our faith foundation, but doing it in a public way, because the act of preaching, the act of being a Christian is always meant to be impacting the world and not just something done within the four walls of a church.
Thank you.
So education, pamphlets within the actual worship and within prayer time. If I would add to that, as you're aware, is we also then participate in public acts with other groups, when we've hosted the Peace Vigil, when we've taken part in the marches. So all those are ways we are involved in working for peace. Peace is not simply the absence of violence, because that is a definition that is a negative definition. Peace is, I would use the Old Testament, the shalom language of the Hebrew word. Peace is the presence of a wholeness and an integrity in our relationships. So what that does is we're calling for peace in homes, in all relationships between people, in the way we talk, in the way we work together. So it's a larger concept, and the Jewish concept of shalom is probably the best embodiment of that. It is a wholeness where the gifts that we're each given, the opportunities that are provided as men and women in America, are equally available to all and equally nurtured in all. So one is the idea of wholeness, and with that is also integrity. Passive model is one that simply says we would rely more on prayer and maybe working behind the scenes than taking a public stand. And there is a place for that, but I don't think that should be the first and foremost action. An activist model that says we would, be disruptive, we would block, street traffic, we would do sit-ins. There is a place for that, but that has to be carefully thought through, and it has to be a measured response. I think I would go for a third model, which would be following the example of Dr. King and the idea of nonviolence, but that's also civil disobedience. Now, when Gandhi did nonviolence, when King did nonviolence, their model, they always informed the authorities, they always informed the people, this is our plan, we're going to be doing this, because their goal was not to create enemies in the midst of speaking of peace and love. Their goal was to try and find ways where even those opposing them could safely come over to their side. So Gandhi would tell the authorities before he did the Salt March, he would tell them, here's our route, here's where we're going, and we plan on this day to illegally harvest sea salt. And there were hundreds of thousands of people that followed him, but the way he did it was as important as what he did. So I guess my understanding is that churches are called to speak out, and people are called to speak out, and they should do actions that sincerely reach out to the other side, allow them the chance to move towards a compromised position or move towards the right action. So no one gains by destroying another person in order to try and build yourself up. Mm-hmm. And that's just as true from the peace movement as it is from the other side. So active engagement that's nonviolent means that your means are also in keeping with your end goal. Mm-hmm. And the civic disobedience, where it occurs, if you're doing it with authenticity and full disclosure, allows for the other side to engage with you, or perhaps come to see the integrity of your speech and what your goal is. So I would push for that. America's gotten pretty savvy, that they learned the lessons from the civil rights movement. The government, for example, in this war doesn't photograph or allow people to document when the caskets come back of the soldiers. So it may be time for a different level of civil disobedience. The sit-ins, the protests, the parades now have become somewhat sanitized because the world is either used to them or the government has figured out ways to defang them, take the power out of them. But we still have to be careful to make sure that our means are in keeping with our ends. I would only say that there are few goals as important as working for peace. There are a few things that are as consequential. It works, so a plus and a minus. The plus side is that as much as your approach to it can have an international perspective, the healthier it'll be. Because any discussion about peace that only arises out of one nation's perspective is always going to be partial and probably flawed. So any working for peace needs to have the voices from the international community, and any solutions proposed have to be partnered with international folk. That I share that because I spent 3 years living in Europe and 3 years serving a church in Africa. So that shapes, I can't talk about peace without seeing the families that I lived with and worked with in Africa and in Germany and in Austria. So if you have that perspective, I think that's one of the healthiest ways to go about talking about peace. Is that within America, it's very easy to speak out for peace, to be involved in protests and rallies and sign petitions, and then we're done. Then we decide, okay, well, I've done my bit, I can go back to my Starbucks and movies. Mm-hmm. So the challenge is how to engage even beyond the action itself, how to stay informed. And we still struggle with that. So at some point we will be able to sacrificially work for peace and hopefully through that bring about real change.